The Montana winter was unforgiving, biting winds, frozen lakes, and a silence so deep it could swallow the sound of a man's breath. But on this particular morning, that silence was broken. James Harrison had spent decades behind a camera capturing the wild in its rawest form. He had seen nature's beauty and its cruelty, but nothing could have prepared him for what he stumbled upon that day: a desperate splash of fran cry, and then through the mist rising off the half-frozen reservoir, he saw it, a bobcat trapped in the ice, its once mighty frame reduced to trembling weakness as the frigid water pulled it closer to death. Every instinct told James to turn away. Bobcats were wild, unpredictable, dangerous, but something in the animals' golden eyes stopped him in his tracks. What happened next wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something no one could have expected, because when the wild meets kindness, sometimes it remembers. The bitter wind howled across the Montana landscape, cutting through James Harrison's thick winter coat as he made his way along the shoreline of Echo Lake Reservoir at 58. The retired wildlife photographer had seen his fair share of harsh winters, but something about this January morning felt different. The thermometer had dipped well below zero overnight, and sheets of ice had formed along the reservoir edges, creating a treacherous mixture of frozen and liquid water. James hadn't planned on visiting the reservoir that morning. His arthritis usually kept him indoors on days like this, but something had drawn him out. Perhaps it was the unique quality of light that filtered through the heavy clouds, or maybe it was simply destiny. Whatever the reason, he found himself carefully picking his way along the rocky shore, his camera bag slung over his shoulder, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the winter stillness. At first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on his ears, but then he heard it again, a desperate splashing sound followed by what could only be described as a cry for help. James quickened his pace, his boots crunching through the fresh snow as he rounded a bend in the shoreline. What he saw next made his heart skip a beat. About 30 feet from shore, trapped in a patch of partially frozen water, was a bobcat. The animal was struggling weakly, its normally graceful movements reduced to desperate thrashing as it fought to keep its head above water. Ice crystals had formed in its tawny fur, and its usually fierce eyes were glazed with exhaustion. James knew bobcats well. He'd photographed them countless times over his career, always maintaining a respectful distance. They were typically elusive creatures, masters of stealth and survival. To see one in such a vulnerable state was both shocking and heartbreaking. Time seemed to slow as James assessed the situation. The bobcat couldn't have been in the water for more than 15 or 20 minutes given the temperature, but even though it was pushing the limits of survival, he could see its movements becoming increasingly sluggish, its head dipping dangerously close to the water's surface. Without conscious thought, James dropped his camera bag and began stripping off his heavy coat. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to stop. This was dangerous, foolish. Even bobcats were wild animals known for their fierce temperament, and a cornered wild animal was unpredictable at best. Moreover, the water temperature had to be near freezing. He could easily become a victim himself, but James couldn't stand by and watch the creature die. 25 years of photographing wildlife had taught him that these animals weren't just subjects for his lens. They were beings with their own stories, their own will to live, and right now, this one needed help. Hold on, little friend, he muttered, more to steady his own nerves than anything else. He kept his movements deliberate and calm as he waded into the frigid water, gasping as the cold hit him like a physical blow. The rocky bottom was treacherous, slick with algae and ice, but he pressed forward, using his photographer's eye to plot the safest path through the partially frozen water. The bobcat's eyes locked onto him as he approached, but there was no fight left in them, no hint of the fierce predator. It normally would be just exhaustion Fear, and perhaps though James knew this, might be his imagination a glimmer of hope when he finally reached the animal. James was shocked by how small it looked. Up close, without its usual proud bearing. It seemed almost delicate, its fur was matted against its body, revealing how thin it actually was beneath its usually fluffy coat. This wasn't just bad luck. James realized the bobcat had probably been struggling to find food in the harsh winter conditions, which might explain why it had ventured so close to the reservoir in the first place with as much gentleness as his numbing hands could manage. James reached for the bobcat. He expected some resistance, a last-minute show of wild instinct, but the animal remained eerily still as he slipped his arms beneath it. Its body was frighteningly cold, its breathing shallow and rapid. The journey back to shore seemed to take an eternity. James's legs had gone numb, and each step required intense concentration to avoid slipping. On the treacherous bottom, the bobcat lay, limp in his arms, its head resting against his chest, its breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Once on shore, James's training kicked, and he'd worked closely with wildlife rehabilitators over the years documenting their work, and he knew the basics of handling injured animals. Moving quickly despite his shivering, he retrieved an emergency blanket from his camera bag and gently wrapped the bobcat, careful to keep its head free. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was in Kalispell, about 40 minutes away. James knew every minute counted. He gathered his belongings with trembling hands and hurried to his truck, placing the wrapped bobcat on the passenger seat with infinite care. The drive to the Northern Lights Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was a blur of anxiety and determination. James kept the heater running full blast, dividing his attention between the icy road and his unexpected passenger. The bobcat remained unusually quiet throughout the journey, its eyes half closed but occasionally flickering toward James as if checking that he was still there. Dr. Sarah Martinez was waiting at the center's entrance when James pulled up, having been alerted by his frantic phone call. A veteran wildlife veterinarian with 15 years of experience, she had treated everything from injured eagles to orphan bear cubs, but even she seemed surprised by the unusual calm of their newest patient. "This is remarkable," she murmured as they rushed the bobcat into the treatment room. "Usually they're spitting mad by now, even when injured. This one seems different." The next few hours were crucial. The bobcat's core temperature was dangerously low, and it showed signs of exhaustion and moderate malnutrition. But as they worked to warm and stabilize it, James noticed something extraordinary. While the animal remained alert and aware, it showed none of the typical fear or aggression one would expect from a wild predator in captivity. Instead, it seemed to watch the proceedings with an almost human-like patience, its golden eyes following their movements with quiet intensity. "He's a male, probably around 3 years old," Drive Martinez announced after completing her examination. Apart from the hypothermia and exhaustion, he's actually in relatively good shape. No broken bones, no internal injuries that I can detect. He's a bit undernourished, but that's not unusual for this time of year. James felt an inexplicable relief at this news. "How long will his recovery take?" "Hard to say, a few weeks at minimum. We'll need to monitor him closely for secondary complications from the hypothermia, and he'll need to regain his strength before we can consider release." She paused, studying James's face. "You know, we could use some help with his care, someone who understands bobcats, who might be willing to volunteer sometime." The offer caught James by surprise, but he found himself nodding before she'd even finished speaking. Something about this animal called to him, stirred memories of why he'd fallen in love with wildlife photography in the first place. "I'd be honored," he heard himself say, and so began an extraordinary partnership. The Wildlife Center had a special rehabilitation enclosure designed for medium-sized predators, and James helped outfit it specifically for their bobcat patient, whom the staff had started calling Echo after the reservoir where He was found the enclosure was spacious, enough to allow Echo to move around comfortably while recovering his strength, with various platforms at different heights and several hiding spots to help him feel secure. James spent hours each day there, first just sitting quietly, allowing Echo to become accustomed to his presence, then gradually taking on more active roles in his care. What struck everyone at the center was Echo's unusual behavior. While he maintained a healthy weariness of most staff members, he seemed to recognize James as his rescuer. When James entered the enclosure to clean or bring food, Echo would watch him intently, but without any sign of aggression. Sometimes he would even approach, maintaining a careful distance, but clearly showing interest in James's presence. "I've never seen anything quite like it," Dr. Martinez commented one day, watching through the OBS a window as James placed fresh water in the enclosure. Echo was perched on a nearby platform, his tail swishing slowly as he followed James's movements. Bobcats are usually solitary by nature, deeply territorial. They typically want nothing to do with humans, even in captivity. But this one, it's almost like he understands what happened. James spent countless hours documenting Echo's recovery, with his camera capturing the Bobcat's gradual transformation from the desperate creature he'd pulled from the reservoir. Day by day, Echo's coat regained its healthy luster, his muscles rebuilt their strength, and his eyes brightened with renewed vitality. But unlike most rehabilitated predators, who typically become more defensive as they regained their strength, Echo maintained his unusual connection with James. This unique relationship led to some remarkable moments. One particularly memorable incident occurred about 3 weeks into Echo's recovery. James was sitting in his usual spot in the enclosure, reviewing photos on his camera, when he felt something brush against his leg. Looking down, he found Echo sitting beside him, close enough to touch, but maintaining a respectful distance. The Bobcat met his startled gaze with what seemed like perfect composure, then slowly blinked, a gesture that in cats often signifies trust and contentment. The encounter lasted only a few moments before Echo gracefully retreated to his face platform, but it left James deeply moved. He'd spent decades photographing wild animals, trying to capture their essence through his lens, but he'd never experienced such a direct connection with one before. As Echo's strength returned, the center staff began discussing his eventual release. The standard protocol was to return rehabilitated animals to their original territory, but given the harsh winter conditions that had contributed to Echo's predicament, they decided to wait for more favorable weather. This delay proved fortunate, as it allowed James to help prepare Echo for his return to the wild. Under Dr. Martinez's guidance, they began placing live prey in the enclosure. First mice, then rabbits, to ensure Echo hadn't lost his hunting skills. They were relieved to see that his instincts remained sharp. He proved to be an efficient hunter, though James noticed that Echo would often wait until he had left the enclosure before making his kills, as if reluctant to display his predatory nature in front of his human friend. Finally, in early March, with the worst of winter behind them, the team decided it was time for Echo's release. They chose a protected area within the Flathead National Forest, about 20 miles from where James had found him. The location offered plenty of natural prey and was far enough from human settlements to give Echo the best chance of success. The morning of the release dawned clear and cold, with a hint of spring in the air. James arrived at the center early, his heart heavy with mixed emotions. He knew this was the right thing to do. Echo was a wild animal after all, belonged in the wilderness, but over the past 6 weeks he'd grown deeply attached to this remarkable creature. Dr. Martinez helped him prepare Echo for transport, sedating him lightly to minimize stress. During the journey, as they worked, she noticed James's emotional struggle. "You know," she said gently, "what you did that Day at the reservoir, it wasn't just about saving one animal's life. You've helped us learn something important. About these creatures, Echo has shown us that there's more to predator-prey relationships than we thought, more complexity to their emotional lives. The drive to the release site was quiet, with James occasionally glancing at the transport crate in his rearview mirror. Echo was alert but calm, his golden eyes meeting James's whenever he looked back. The Forest Service had helped select an ideal release point, a clearing surrounded by dense woods with a small stream nearby and plenty of natural cover. As they carried the crate to the release point, James found himself remembering all the moments of the past 6 weeks. The first time Echo had approached him in the enclosure, the quiet hours spent in each other's company, the gradual building of trust between man and wild animal. He knew he would never forget this experience, but he also knew it was time to let go. They set the crate down in the clearing, pointing its opening toward the forest. James knelt beside it, speaking softly to Echo one last time. "Be well, my friend," he whispered. "Stay safe out there." With steady hands, he unlatched the crate door and stepped back. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then slowly, Echo emerged. He paused at the threshold, his nose twitching as he took in the sense of the forest. But instead of bolting immediately for cover as most released predators did, he turned and looked directly at James. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity. In Echo's golden eyes, James saw something that defied easy explanation, a recognition and understanding, perhaps even a form of gratitude. Then with deliberate grace, Echo stepped forward and pressed one paw into the soft earth before him, creating a perfect print in the damp soil. With one final look at his rescuer, Echo turned and moved toward the forest. There was no mad dash for freedom, no panic or fear, and instead he walked with dignity and purpose, his movements sure and confident. At the edge of the clearing, he paused once more, looking back over his shoulder at James. Then, with the silent grace that made Bobcats such successful hunters, he disappeared into the undergrowth. James stood in the clearing long after Echo had vanished, his camera forgotten at his side. Dr. Martinez waited patiently nearby, understanding the significance of the moment. Finally, she approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "I think he left you something." She pointed to the ground where Echo had paused. Their press clearly in the soil was the perfect imprint of a bobcat's paw, a deliberate mark, almost like a signature. James knelt to examine it, feeling a profound sense of completion. With careful movements, he took several photographs of the print, knowing that this final gift from Echo would become one of his most treasured images. The story of James and Echo quickly spread throughout the local community and beyond. James wrote an article for a national wildlife magazine, accompanied by his photographs documenting Echo's recovery, the Peace Challenge, common perceptions about predator species, and highlighted the importance of wildlife rehabilitation work. The Northern Lights Wildlife Rehabilitation Center saw an increase in support and volunteers after the story was published. Dr. Martinez used Echo's case in her presentations about wildlife behavior, helping to educate people about the complexity of wild animals and the importance of maintaining their habitats. As for James, he continued his wildlife photography with renewed purpose, but he never forgot his experience with Echo in the years that followed. He occasionally returned to the release site, hoping to catch a glimpse of his old friend. While he never saw Echo again, local wildlife cameras sometimes captured images of a healthy male bobcat in the area, distinguishable by a unique pattern of spots on his left flank, the same pattern James had photographed during Echo's rehabilitation. These occasional sightings brought James comfort, confirming that Echo had successfully readapted to life in the wild, but more than that, they reminded him of an extraordinary truth that sometimes in the most unexpected circumstances, the Boundaries between wild and tame, between human and animal could blur in remarkable ways. Echo had taught him that, while respect for wild animals true, nature was essential, there was also room for connection, for understanding, and perhaps even for friendship. The paw print photograph hung in James's study, a daily reminder of those transformative weeks. Visitors often asked about it, and James would tell them the story of Echo, the bobcat who had shown him that sometimes the most profound connections come not from words or actions, but from simple presence, trust, and mutual respect. In the end, Echo's story became more than just a tale of rescue and rehabilitation. It became a testament to the complexity of wild creatures, the importance of conservation, in the remarkable bonds that can form between species when compassion overcomes fear. For James, it remained a powerful reminder that in saving Echo's life that cold winter morning, he had received something equally precious in return: a deeper understanding of the wild heart that beats in all living things, and the knowledge that sometimes the most meaningful thank you comes not in words or gestures, but in the silent language of trust freely given. Human interest in the story continued to grow, leading to local news coverage and eventually a short documentary about wildlife rehabilitation work. The film featured James' photographs and interviews with Dr. Martinez and other staff at the Northern Lights Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. It helped raise awareness about the challenges facing wild animals in an increasingly developed world and the importance of maintaining professional wildlife rehabilitation facilities. James eventually established a photography scholarship fund for students interested in wildlife documentation. Using the proceeds from his Echo photographs and article, the scholarship emphasized the importance of ethical wildlife photography and conservation awareness, ensuring that Echo's legacy would continue to inspire future generations of wildlife advocates. The experience also led to changes in local wildlife management practices. The area around Echo Lake Reservoir was designated as a protected wildlife corridor, with new guidelines implemented for human activity during the harsh winter months. Local authorities installed warning signs and educational plaques about wildlife safety, using Echo story as an example of responsible human wildlife interaction. Dr. Martinez continued to study the unique behavioral patterns Echo had displayed during his rehabilitation. She published several papers on animal cognition and intelligence in wild predators, challenging traditional assumptions about wildlife behavior. Her research suggested that animals like bobcats might possess a greater capacity for recognition and relationship building than previously thought, though she was careful to emphasize that such cases were exceptional and should not encourage casual interaction with wild animals. The following winter, James found himself drawn back to Etchall Lake Reservoir more frequently. He set up wildlife cameras in the area, hoping to document the seasonal patterns of local wildlife and prevent similar accidents. His efforts led to the discovery of several natural wildlife corridors that crossed the reservoir area, information that proved valuable for local conservation efforts. One crisp morning, almost exactly a year after Echo's rescue, James was reviewing footage from his trail cameras when he made a remarkable discovery. In one nighttime sequence, a healthy male bobcat appeared, moving with familiar grace. The cat paused directly in front of the camera, and James's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the distinctive spot pattern. It was Echo, but what made the footage truly extraordinary was what happened next. Echo briefly touched his paw to the ground before continuing on his way, eerily similar to his gesture at the release site. James couldn't prove it was an intentional echo of their farewell, but the coincidence moved him deeply. He shared the footage with Dr. Martinez, who included it in her ongoing research about animal memory and recognition. patterns while she maintained scientific objectivity in her analysis. She privately admitted to James that Echo's case had changed her perspective on wildlife rehabilitation. Sometimes, she told him, we focus so much on the biological aspects of rehabilitation that we forget these animals are individuals, each with their own capacity for adaptation and connection. Echo taught us that while we must always respect their wild nature, we shouldn't underestimate their ability to form meaningful connections. The story's impact rippled outward in unexpected ways. Local schools began incorporating Echo's tale into their environmental education programs, using it to teach children about wildlife conservation and the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries with wild animals. James was frequently invited to speak at these programs, sharing his photographs and experiences while emphasizing the crucial message that Echo's case was unique and that wild animals should always be treated with cautious respect. 5 years after the rescue, the Northern Lights Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had grown into one of the most respected facilities of its kind in the Northwest. They had expanded their facilities and implemented many of the lessons learned from Echo's rehabilitation. Each new case was approached with a deeper understanding of the potential complexity of wild animal behavior while still maintaining strict protocols for safety and professional distance. James continued his wildlife photography, but his focus had shifted. Rather than just capturing images of animals in their natural habitat, he began documenting the delicate balance between human development and wildlife preservation. His work highlighted the importance of maintaining wildlife corridors and natural habitats, showing how human activity affected animal behavior and survival strategies. Echo's story became a cornerstone of local conservation efforts, cited in proposals for wildlife protection measures and used to illustrate the importance of professional wildlife rehabilitation facilities. While everyone involved emphasized that Echo's behavior was exceptional and not typical of wild animals, his story helped change public perception of predator species from fearsome threats to essential parts of the ecosystem deserving of respect and protection. The PA print photograph remained James' most requested image, and he always took care to share it in context, explaining both the extraordinary nature of his experience with Echo and the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries with wildlife. The image became a symbol of the complex relationship between humans and wild animals, a reminder that while we must respect and preserve their wild nature, we are all part of the same intricate web of life. As the years passed, occasional reports of Bobcat sightings in Echo's territory continued to come in. While it became impossible to know with certainty which sightings might be Echo himself, the healthy population of Bobcats in the area stood as testament to the success of the conservation efforts his story had inspired. The legacy of that cold winter morning lived on, not just in James' memories or Dr. Martinez's research, but in the preserved wilderness where future generations of both humans and animals could thrive in their own separate but interconnected ways. For James, the greatest lesson from his experience with Echo was about the balance between connection and respect. He had formed a remarkable bond with a wild creature, but that bond was meaningful precisely because it was temporary, a brief intersection of two different worlds that parted ways when the time was right. Echo had taught him that sometimes the deepest connections come not from trying to change or tame the wild, but from simply being present and offering help when needed, than having the wisdom and courage to let go. And so Echo's story became more than just a tale of rescue and rehabilitation. It became a parable about the delicate dance between humans and wildlife, about the importance of maintaining both connection and distance, and about the unexpected ways that compassion can bridge the gap between two very different worlds. In saving Echo That winter morning, James had not just preserved a life, he had helped write a new chapter in our understanding of the complex and beautiful relationship between humans and the wild creatures with whom we share our world.